Hello, my name is Donovan Cleckley. This YouTube video includes audio from my recent X Space, dated Wednesday, January 28, discussing the work of Janice G. Raymond on transsexualism and transgenderism. It is session 1 of a small planned series of readings and discussions of Raymond's 1979 book, The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the She-Male, and her 2021 follow-up titled Doublethink, A Feminist Challenge to Transgenderism. This session provides some background information about Raymond's transsexual empire, such as its earlier developments, and discusses the 1979 original introduction, the 1994 introduction to the Teachers College Press edition, and the 2021 introduction to Doublethink. Thank you all so much for listening. So, to start us off, I wanted to just introduce the Transsexual Empire. It started as a conference paper that Raymond had delivered at the New England Regional American Academy of Religion meeting in 1972. Raymond had given a paper. There was a work titled "Beyond Male Morality," which appeared in 1974 in a collection titled "Women in Religion," published by Scholars Press, also for the American Academy of Religion. And in that paper, Raymond dealt with the development of certain values in society, particularly talking about the notions of masculinity and femininity, how they are understood socially. And she talked about the ways in which they are restrictive. And by male morality, she did not mean that all men were bad. She meant that the values that were constructed in society, they were things that these were largely from male created institutions. Um, and her later work, so subsequent to this earlier piece in the earlier 70s, was Transsexualism, the Ultimate Homage to Sex Role Power in 1977, which appeared in Chrysalis, an early feminist journal that was published into the late 70s, think into the 80s as well, although it discontinued. There were later journals that took up the name Chrysalis, in fact, one being a transgender journal that actually took on the name of this prior feminist publication. Um, Interestingly, when Raymond's piece appeared in 1977, it was alongside the Black radical feminist Audre Lorde's "Poetry is Not a Luxury," which appeared under the title "Poems Are Not Luxuries." And Raymond talks about how that original work that became the Transsexual Empire was her doctoral dissertation that concerned the medical ethics of what at the time was known as sex conversion surgery. So we'll start with that 1979 introduction. And like I mentioned, we will go to um, some brief discussion just to talk about if you have moments that you found interesting or insightful from the introduction, we can certainly talk about those and just highlight some key moments. So starting off, one of the interesting things as it begins is Raymond talks about how while transsexualism is defined in psychological and medical terms as if it is disconnected from social conditions, that as a feminist ethicist, she approached it in terms of how it showed what she calls male defined values and philosophical theological beliefs, which are to say beliefs about the so called natures of women and men. And from the very beginning, she brings up John Money, who, as many know, uh, began the first work on gender identity With regard to infants, he argued that, for instance, that the core of one's gender identity is fixed by the age of 18 months. Um, and much of the research that Money produced, as Raymond notes, had these beliefs that went unquestioned because he would produce everything in terms of quote unquote scientific data. And as we know over time, Money's dominion has been questioned, although it has interestingly become integrated into the structure of transgenderism as we know it, with modern trans activists often denying Money's original role in the creation and the legitimation of transsexualism decades ago. One of the key terms that Raymond uses in that early introduction in 1979 is theodicy, which she says, and this is a great quote from let me see, page 2. In this theodicy, as in all religious theodicies, the surrender of selfhood is necessary to a certain extent. In the medical theodicy, transsexuals surrender themselves to the transsexual therapist and technicians. The medical order then tells transsexuals what is healthy and unhealthy, the theological equivalents of good and evil. Thus, the classification function of the term transsexualism analyzes a whole system of meaning that is endowed with an extraordinary power of structuring reality. And what she means there when she talks about theodicy is that in the secular sense, and of course, she talks about medicine and psychology as secular religions with regard to transsexualism. And the notions of good and evil become expressed as healthy and unhealthy, that which later, as we know, developed into of affirmation. So a way of justifying one's existence through a therapeutic treatment. And Raymond takes issue in the Transsexual Empire with what, as she says, is more and more moral problems have been reclassified as technical problems, and indeed, how the very notion of health itself, as generated by this medical model, has made genuine transcendence of the transsexual problem almost impossible. And she starts immediately with acknowledging the difficulties in language surrounding the issue, which was certainly an issue in 1979, uh, even now even more so than perhaps then. But with the medical literature on transsexualism at the time, there was the notion, there was masculinity masculine, femininity feminine, and there would often be um, a failure to draw a distinction that the male who feminized himself was not female, that the medical literature at the time would equate feminization with acquiring femaleness and equate masculinization with acquiring maleness, that it was a kind of buying or taking on sex through this use of the masculine and the feminine. And that the surgically constructed or hormonally constructed change, that despite it being superficial, which it is, that there was this falseness, or a false sense of it being deeper than it was. And Raymond says to feminize or masculinize into a cultural identity and role is to socialize one into a constructed identity and role. And she emphasizes the process of socialization throughout this work. So it is not that femininity and masculinity just sit there separate to the society in which people live. Um, and her point in utilizing the language of masculinization and feminization, as she says, is to point to the superficial stereotyping involved behind um, this use of surgical and hormonal interventions to give men what they believe to be the semblance of womanhood, and women what they believe to be the semblance of manhood. um, and it is interesting. She says maleness and femaleness are governed by certain chromosomes and the subsequent history of being a chromosomal male or female. Masculinity and femininity are social and surgical constructs. And she was later criticized over her use of chromosomes in the transsexual empire, although the part that people leave out, or that her critics leave out, is that she talks about the history of being a male or female. So it's not just chromosomes, which she was later accused by Judith Shapiro in a criticism, which we'll come back to in the 1994 intro. Judith Shapiro accused her of having a chromosomes or destiny view. But Raymond, in fact, discussed how it was not only chromosomes or biology itself, but rather the experience of living in a female or male body in society that was part of this fundamental difference between women and men. That it was an embodied difference and not simply about the like chromosomal. Um, and she talks about the origin of the word transsexualism, and how it was first used by Harry Benjamin. He used it in a lecture in 1953 when he was talking at the New York Academy of Medicine. And however, it would not appear in the Index Medicus until over a decade later in 1965. And prior to its appearance in the Index Medicus, the works dealing with sex conversion surgery would be classified under transvestism, homosexuality, or what would be some other category. But prior to 1965, transsexualism was not in the Index Medicus. However, she notes that as transsexualism acquired its own terminological existence and independent classification, then the assumptions of it being a state of being, of it being just there, came into being essentially. And I like that she points out the value of using transsexualism, the suffix ism, referring to an ideology. And for her, she's referring to how it has to do with a system of beliefs, which is to say that it is not just an industry. Industries do not operate independent of ideologies. And we recognize the notion of an overarching ideology behind transgenderism or transsexualism then. And we see that more recently as expressed in Helen Joyce's Trans When Ideology Meets Reality from 2021. At this point in the audio, when I mentioned Helen Joyce's 2021 book, Trans When Ideology Meets Reality, the space disconnected. I do apologize for the technical difficulties. The session will now continue. The way that psychiatric syndrome was used, which Raymond discusses, it was actually interesting in the late '60s work on transsexualism. Um, they used the phrase psychiatric syndrome and then went on to say, is any patient who seeks castration by surgery by definition psychotic? We do not find this to be the case, which is very weird, which is very weird to pretend that like the request for castration by surgery, that there's not anything, any kind of psychosis or anything psychotic about it, which shows that even the use of psychiatric syndrome was less an acknowledgement of it as something like a disease, but an attempt to get around the fact that the authors themselves, and this was even in that earliest work from Money and Green in 1969, that they did not believe transsexualism to be of biological origin. There is still no research to indicate that it is of biological origin. And Raymond brings up one of the interesting early insights from that period from the 60s into early 70s, which was John Money's notion of the six sexes, which which of course sounds ridiculous, but Money defined chromosomal sex, anatomical or morphological sex, genital or gonadal sex, legal sex, endocrine or hormonal sex, and psychological sex. And of course, he split this in this way so that there was an acknowledgement of somehow some kind of varying difference among all of these, which there is a certain amount of subjectivity to the way that Money approached it. And Raymond actually notes that with psychological sex, it would likely be better to say like psychosocial sex, indicating that it was not purely psychological, but rather that what he called psychological sex did have to do with the socialization of girls and boys in society. And she also mentioned, so apart from Green and Money, who did Transsexualism and Sex Reassignment in 1969, Raymond brings up the contributions of Robert Stoller, who actually coined gender identity in 1964. And Stoller, in his book Sex and Gender in 1968, actually defined the split between sex and gender. He talks about sex in biological terms and says the word sexual will have connotations of anatomy and physiology. However, he says there is behavior, feelings, thoughts, and fantasies that are related to the sexes, but do not have primarily biological connotations. And so, for the psychological phenomena, Stoller said, okay, well, let's use gender for all of that. So for Stoller, there was already that split, and this was in 68, so 1968. And then, for those who have talked about like the true transsexual, that also already was a thing in 1969. Ira Polly in Green and Money's 1969 anthology said, quote, "In the true transsexual, there is no question of or ambivalence about the gender preference, for the identification has been completed for some time at the point when they appear before the physician requesting sex reassignment." That quote goes back to what Raymond says about theodicy, where medical treatment becomes a way of dealing with the suffering of women and men who feel this kind of, quote unquote, gender dysphoria or this dissatisfaction that come into the clinical setting. And Raymond notes that there's a lot of trouble with the use of the word gender. She says that when used with words like dissatisfaction, discomfort, dysphoria, it gives us a sense of everything being able to be reduced to therapy and technical means. So it removes the social dimension from the issue. So, for instance, she says here, feminists have described gender satisfaction and dissatisfaction in very different terms as sex role oppression, sexism, etc. It is significant that there is no specialized or therapeutic vocabulary of Black dissatisfaction, Black discomfort, or Black dysphoria that has been institutionalized in Black identity clinics, which I think is fascinating that Raymond was bringing up the parallel to transracialism in '79 and was noting that there were no clinics that dealt with race the way that there were clinics that dealt with gender. And there have been no clinics that deal with race the way they deal with gender, um, barring the individual exceptions of people like Rachel Dolezal or Martina Big, who have been figures recognized as transracial or folks who take that up. And let's see, I want to go to. And she noted that the experts began the move away from using transsexualism and away from using the ism toward the more general use of the word gender dysphoria as of 1975. Or really when it changed, so the Second International Conference on Transsexualism was renamed to the Second International Conference of Gender Dysphoria. And so it became the use of gender dysphoria became a way to name a condition rather than acknowledge the circumstances of transsexualism that then um, produce the, quote unquote gender dysphoria. And she writes, and this is on page 12, to make it the private property, so to speak, of the transsexual empire and its professionals is to superficialize the depths of the questions that lie behind gender dysphoria. And she notes that there have been issues with the way in which the surgery was popularized post Christine Jorgensen, and this is to say into the 1960s. The specific need for surgery was not evident, although some people may have felt that they wanted to change sex. And she argues that we cannot be certain to what extent the availability of surgery has generated a wider need for it, because the terminology has masked it, has made it seem as if it was always that way, as if folks always needed this surgery, and people were just dying without it. Um, Now, one thing I want to acknowledge too is Raymond has been criticized, and she notes this on page 14 in that 1979 introduction, for mostly just talking about men, because the Transsexual Empire, it did primarily involve male patients when it began. And I will get more into the statistics of that as we go, although the Raymond's argument for it being primarily or almost exclusively a male phenomenon was not just it wasn't just like she was saying, oh, it's this because patriarchy. No, it was actually because the statistics indicated that virtually all of the patients were males early on, and the statistics were on the high end, which was seen in the study from Harry Benjamin. It was one woman for every 8 men. On the low end, it was one woman for every 3 to 4 men. So there were on average there were 3 to 4 times as many men seeking transsexual surgeries and hormonal interventions, and on the high end it was 8 times as many men. So when you have a ratio like that, you do have a significant imbalance of whose interest would be met, in terms of a patient population there. And let's see. And to go to the end of that first introduction, Raymond talks about how transsexualism is a social problem that cannot be explained without reference to the society in which we live and the sex roles in which women and men come to live. So the way that it's treated in terms of a purely medical phenomenon, a purely psychological phenomenon, ends up leaving out the entire dimension of the social context for it. Um, and what I would like to emphasize too, and this is at the very end of her introduction, she talks about how um, she's not, she says, I'm not arguing that what is natural is good. I'm not polarizing technology against nature. Rather, I'm making an appeal to the integrity or harmony of the whole, which is why she deals with this in a chapter called An Ethic of Integrity. And so she's not saying that it's just about a violation of a static nature of maleness or femaleness, but there is a kind of being and becoming that have to do with bodily integrity and the integrity of our bodies that becomes violated through this attempt to um, artificially simulate the opposite sex. And again, she also emphasizes that chromosomes contribute, she says this, chromosomes contribute to bodily integrity, but chromosomal maleness and femaleness, they're not the only thing there. And she actually says here, quote, rather, I'm emphasizing that medicalized intervention produces harmful effects in the transsexual's body that negate bodily integrity, wholeness, and being. And so she does make a great emphasis on the integrity of the body and bodily integrity that become violated through regimes of surgery and hormones. And she ends that intro with, quote, transsexualism is a half truth that highlights the desperate situation of those individuals in our society who have been uniquely body bound by gender constructions. But it is not a whole truth. While transsexualism poses the question of so called gender agony, it fails to give an answer. I hope to show that it amounts to a solution that only reinforces the society and social norms that produce transsexualism to begin with. And that first introduction for the Transsexual Empire in 1979. And so the 1994 intro, Raymond comes back with, again, she's back. And it is, there is a humor in it because the attempt was there was a strong attempt, which she discusses in the intro to Doublethink, to prevent the second like republication of the book. So there was actually already a pushback by 1994. And of course this is post 1990, which was the publication of Judith Butler's Gender Trouble and Eve Kozofsky Sedgwick's Epistemology of the Closet. So already queer theory had laid its roots, and the environment was far more hostile to publish, to even republish this book. And we'll get into that with Doublethink because she talks about it. But she talks about how in '79, Johns Hopkins um, phased out its procedure and dismantled its gender identity committee. Now, this actually did not have to do with the transsexual empire. At least Raymond notes that she does not think that was the case. She points to a study from the psychiatrist John Meyer, who was director at Johns Hopkins, and he had kept a follow up of those who had come to the Johns Hopkins clinic. And it was noted that it was, quote unquote, a palliative measure, but it does not cure what is essentially a psychiatric disturbance. So Meyer then closed and agreed on closing the program. Trans activists have attributed the closure of the program to Raymond's Transsexual Empire, but the idea that they read Raymond's book and took her advice is unlikely. And the clinic gave no indication that it did actually sit and read her book and use, or go by her advice. It did have to do with that follow-up study that indicated there was actually not a vast improvement in the mental health of the people who had come to the clinic. And Raymond brings up the fact that John Money, who in the 50s and 60s and even in the early 70s, he had done his sex slash gender, or gender identity slash sex roles research. And he talked about sex roles and gender in more of an abstract way at that time. But his later research, as it got into the 70s and the 80s especially, and then into the 90s, concerned arguments for, as money would argue, for the permissibility of child pornography and incest. And so Raymond notes that Money, in one of the works that he did into the 80s, uh, he actually argued, quote, this is Money: when the genuine pair bonding of erotic love has existed between the two partners in incest, then the discovery and disbanding of their partnership, not the partnership itself, may be the source of trauma. End quote. Which is to say, Money was saying that the worst thing about incest would be the stigma, not the incest itself. And he compared a man who commits incest against, which would largely be against a girl, or young, or a child. Money compared that to being a religious deviant in a one religion society. So money effectively was viewing incest as a man who commits incest as being like somebody who does not conform to dominant religion. And so Money was originally over the Johns Hopkins. He was a large part of the Johns Hopkins program. So his gradual writing on the permissibility of quote unquote adult child sex, which is to say child sexual abuse, became a point of contention that caused, I think, and Raymond also argues this, that it was likely a strong contributor to the decline of that clinic, more than certainly more than the likelihood of them actually sitting down and reading the Transsexual Empire. And Raymond brings up that, and this was interesting, by 1994, the number of clinics and centers did not seem to increase or decrease at that time. So from 79 to 1994, no increase or decrease, seemed to be about the same. And the pattern that she observed, which was that most of the patients were men who were desiring to be women, that actually held up. So she points to the University of Minnesota's program, which was the second U.S. institution to perform the surgery. 85% were men who were transitioning. So it was, and that was as of 1992, 85%. So that shows also that she was utilizing statistics when she said that it was largely a male phenomenon. And she points to like the relative lack of women pursuing um, social and medical transition, having to do in a way with the fact that um, women's quote unquote gender dissatisfaction was primarily directed um, in conformity to femininity, including breast implants, hormone replacement therapy, infertility hormones, and reproductive procedures, and general plastic surgeries for women. So there was less of, it seemed to be, and Raymond makes a convincing case that it seemed to be um, less of an experiment for women than for men who would play at getting to um, be feminine. And of course, she brings up um, money's actually something that came from John Money, which was quote unquote, it's easier to construct a hole than a pole, which was what John Money, part of John Money's view of treating people who had genital damage, which, as we know, was the case for the Reimer twins, where he subjected David Reimer to or had him subjected to quote unquote vaginoplasty, which was the destruction of his male genitalia as an infant. Um, and I think she makes an interesting point on women's relative accessibility to men versus men's accessibility to women. She points out that it seems that uh, the idea of maleness is harder for women to access than men to access this sense of being female. And she says, quote, "For if maleness were as easily available as femaleness, that is, if men were as accessible, men too would be treated like women." And end quote. And there is a distinction between the treatment of women and men. Raymond brings up the medical model, and as we know, Thomas Zaz, who critiqued psychiatry, he was a prominent critic. Who also he was a critic of psychiatry, who provided book endorsement for the Transsexual Empire, and he coined various things like trans chronological, right? Like if a person who wants to be young, uh, does that person suffer from being trans chronological? Does a poor person who wants to be rich suffer from the disease of being trans economical? Which I think is funny. And he even brought up, does a black person who wants to be white suffer from the disease of being transracial? And Raymond highlights these, which I think is kind of interesting that Zaz was actually the origin. I think he actually coined transracial, unless it predates him. But he brought up these other trans chronological, trans economical, transracial, and that, of course, we do not have corresponding clinics that have to do with um, age or economic change. we we do not think about those in purely medical or psychological terms the way that we think about issues related to quote unquote gender. Um, and Raymond brings up the analogy um, between gender and race in terms of like highlighting the lack of the presence of clinics that deal with, say, like race, age, or economic dissatisfaction, which I think is fascinating. Um, and going to the critical responses and critics that dealt with her book, she points to like there was a feminist critic named Annie Woodhouse who wrote an otherwise good book called Fantastic Women, and the problem was she accused Raymond of essentialism, which we know is something that is kind of commonly thrown at women who are critical of transsexualism. And she argues um, that Raymond holds this kind of view of the essence of femininity defining women. But Raymond actually, like, she corrects this and says, quote, "It is the female reality that the surgically constructed woman, quotation marks, does not possess, not because women innately carry some essence of femininity, but because these men have not had to live in a female body with all the history that entails." And so for Raymond, it goes back to the body and bodily integrity. That was one critic of Raymond, and then we know that um, one of her other critics was Sandy Stone, who wrote The Empire Strikes Back, a post-transsexual manifesto, which is the founding document of transgender studies. It's recognized now as the founding document of transgender studies. It was written in the late 80s, around 1987, and he continued making changes and editing it, and it appeared in a 1991 collection called Bodyguards, which had to do with arguing for gender ambiguity. And so he wrote a response that um, basically like criticized or wrote a kind of critique, which was really just um, kind of an attack on Raymond. And however, he went to saying that the transsexual is really a text. And she quotes Stone writing, and this is Stone, in the transsexual as text, we may find the potential to map the refigured body onto conventional gender discourse and thereby disrupt it, to take advantage of the dissonances created by such a juxtaposition, to fragment and reconstitute the elements of gender in new and unexpected geometries. Wow, right? Which is, so essentially, Stone talks about um, with the body as text, it can be taken apart and put back together and made into different things, and unexpected geometries. So, like uh, flesh origamis. That is, yeah, it's very dystopian. And so Stone gives, and Raymond acknowledges that he gives Transsexual Empire a kind of backhanded compliment. He says, of course, he says it was the definitive statement on transsexualism by a genetic female academic. And then he follows by saying, quote, there is some hope to be taken that Judith Shapiro's work will supersede Raymond's as such a definitive statement. Shapiro's accounts seem excellently balanced, end quote. It was interesting that Raymond notes that Shapiro actually appropriated much of Raymond's own critique from the Transsexual Empire, but she distances herself from Raymond and presents Raymond as kind of she presents her as prudish. So she says, quote, Raymond contemplated transsexualism with all the frustration and disgust of a missionary watching prime converts backslide into paganism and witchcraft. And then Shapiro brings up all of the anthropological instances of any kind of gender crossing. So goes through Native Americans and then the Oman, then woman to woman marriages in Africa. So brings all these up as being somehow instances of transgender or that rationalize transgenderism. None of those practices, by the way, had a highly well funded industry behind them. So there, it's a false analogy. Um, but Raymond talks about the tolerance being misleading. That what she calls later in the text, which eventually we'll talk about it in a later session, repressive tolerance. Um, she brings up prominent figures of the 90s like RuPaul, where he had said uh, you're born naked and the rest is drag. And of course we know that that kind of that drag, the mentality of drag, the celebration of it, it grew into the 90s. There were not drag queen story hours, but certainly it was ascending as a kind of celebrated or a cultural practice. Um, and she points out the genuine lack of subversiveness in cross dressing, and that it it reduces the political to a kind of personal style. She brings up the appearance of Katie Lang in a spread for the August 1993 issue of Vanity Fair, and Katie Lang is pictured in a very like very role defined and sexually objectifying cover photo. And in fact, one of the captions says, quote, "I have a little bit of penis envy. They're ridiculous, but they're cool." And then the other caption being, "As much as I hate it, I admire the male sexual drive because it's so primal and so animalistic." So even gender nonconformity, quote unquote, was being paired and marketed with a kind of um, explicit sexual objectification, and the notion of, quote unquote, transcending gender was bound up with sexual objectification. And um, and Raymond, and this is toward the very end of the essay, she defines transgenderism. She says, quote, "Transgenderism is the product of a historical period that circumscribes any challenge to sex roles and gender definitions to some form of assimilating these roles and definitions. In much of the Western world, the general effect of the 1980s has been to move back the feminist gains of the 1960s and 1970s. It has encouraged a style rather than a politics of resistance." And she says, of course, that individualism takes over as opposed to collective political challenges to power. And she ends with saying that the ideals of transgenderism look provocative. It seems provocative and subversive, but it does not actually move us beyond gender. It assimilates and reinscribes gender in ways that are harmful, that emphasize and that, of course, monetize and institutionalize surgical profiteering off suffering. And I like the question that she asks, which riffs on um, Kate Bornstein, a trans activist in the 80s and 90s. He had put out a book called Gender Outlaw. And Raymond has a question here that says, "What good is a gender outlaw who is still abiding by the law of gender?" And I always like that. I think it was such a great turn of phrase there. And she says that transgenderism does not present real sexual politics. That um, a real sexual politics would work toward a transformation and moving beyond the reinscribing of gender as such. And that's the intro to the 1994 edition of Raymond's Transsexual Empire. With his permission, I have included the commentary from Michael Costa, editor in chief with Gays Against Groomers. He joined the space to note the influence of Raymond's work on subsequent efforts to end the social and medical transitioning of children abused in the process of surgical and hormonal interventions. In 2024, Gays Against Groomers published a book titled The Gender Trap: The Trans Agenda's War Against Children, work that rightfully acknowledges feminist contributions like Raymond's. There are some exceptions to the prevailing discourse that scapegoats feminism on the basis of self-declared feminists like Donna Haraway and Judith Butler. Costa asked some insightful questions, which I have included with my replies as recorded during the space.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I have a question. You. Yeah, this is probably my favorite book, so it's great that you are taking the time to platform pretty much. I mean, if people had just listened to lesbians, none of this stuff would be happening right now. And I feel like it's really important for people to know, because the lesbian analysis of this issue is, I mean, the most comprehensive in my opinion. I think it's because lesbians are kind of experiencing the negative aspects of gender ideology from multiple points, from the woman thing to the gay aspect to education and medical malpractice. They know it all. And I write for conservative lesbians. I'm looking to elaborate on like the details of Harry Benjamin and WPATH and the history and the connections there. I've reported on the very concerning history of sexology predators like John Money and Harry Benjamin. I want to educate the public and lobby politicians using details about the problematic history and connecting it to the current efforts, and I want to dismantle WPATH permanently. So I want to use these historical details in my legislative lobbying as a way to provide evidence to the government that this wannabe medical organization has always been corrupt and is rooted in backwards views on sex and gender. And I also want to incorporate that history into my news reporting that I do, because I'm convinced that gender medicalization is nothing more than a scam. A scam, a scam, a scam. It has been since the very beginning, since from all the way back in the Harry Benjamin days up to the current ROGD scandal we're currently witnessing unfold in real time. It seems like WPATH has always been riddled with controversy. My question is, what details about the problematic history of WPATH do you recommend I include in my work?
So, with reference to what Raymond writes in Transsexual Empire, I think I think certainly it would be worth mentioning the change in name. So we know that like it changed from H Bigda, which was Harry Benjamin. Like it was originally W Path was named after Harry Benjamin. It was, you see, it was the uh, Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association. So H Bigda, which they changed to W Path, and the shift was pretty recent actually. So it was named in '79 in honor of Harry Benjamin, and then rebranded. Um, was rebranded into the 2000s, and I think that name change is significant, and the connection to Harry Benjamin's original work, because one of the points and one of the terminology part of the terminology that Raymond uses in the Transsexual Empire, which we no longer really think about because so much of the language has been taken over by quote unquote gender affirmation and gender affirming care, is that the original terminology was sex conversion surgery. And the subtitle for Harry Benjamin's original transsexual phenomenon was actually like it had sex conversion in the subtitle. So it was his study of sex conversion, and of sex conversion in males and females, and so it is significant to acknowledge that the language was originally centered around the concept of conversion surgery, and that the rebranding of it toward gender affirmation and the notion of the gender affirming care was specifically to make people think of it not as a conversion and not as like a negation of the body or a negation of the self, but as instead as this like positive affirmation, like self realization. So I think certainly you could and bring up Raymond, of course, but note how she talks about. Um, Harry Benjamin, and she talks about how when he produced these early definitions, he was in a way throwing things at the board to see what stuck. And that's one of the things that is so egregious about Benjamin's work, is that it there are inconsistencies when you read the transsexual phenomenon. There is this like it is strange the way he talks about sex conversion, and also the way that the whole like running the whole gauntlet of it is extraordinarily regressive, but it was so effectively rebranded in progressive terms. And like Raymond said, when she defined transgenderism at the end of that 1994 intro, that it really did function as a backlash against the developments within the women's movement from the 70s into the 80s, and so that 1990s marked a significant um, backlash against the direction that the women's movement had been going. Um, But yeah, I would definitely reference, because Raymond has some great, like, she brings up the terminology of sex conversion even in the intro, and even toward the beginning of the book, that I think is significant, and I think it is a point that people do not, like, readily bring to mind, because the language has become so, it has changed in ways that has permitted a kind of reality control, and permitted, an Orwellian reality control over how people use language, how they think. So yeah, I think that would be something to bring up, with regard to Raymond's specific criticisms and her discussion of Harry Benjamin.
That was a really great answer. I took notes. I really
Oh,
appreciate
thank you.
it. I
uh,
appreciate you having these spaces, and I will definitely be a regular listener.
Oh,
And thank you.
thank you. Thank you. And was there anything, like, that you wanted to mention that was interesting from the 1994 intro?
The difference, John Raymond discussed basically how it's different for a man to wear a dress and heels versus a woman wearing pants and comfortable shoes, and that gender
Yeah.
nonconformity is not reciprocal. Being a tomboy is not the same thing as being a transvestite. Right now, we're seeing these things collide and everything being collapsed under the label of trans. So you have grown men with fetishes reading books to little girls about why they should become boys and acting as if this is all the same thing. The reason why the adults, those men are trans, is not the same reason why those kids are trans. And I put trans in giant quotes. Um, what do you think about what she said about how it's different for one to be a cross-dressing transvestite versus, a woman just who likes to wear slacks, and how that is relevant to the current conversation? And that's the last question I'll ask.
Oh yeah, that's totally fine. So Raymond does discuss that. That's great. I had skipped over it just because I skipped over some things in the intro in the interest of time. So we could get to doublethink. But but yeah, she does make that distinction that women wearing pants is different than men wanting to put on fishnets and wanting to put on skirts, wanting to put on more restrictive clothing that constricts their bodies. And clothing that for the most part is imposed on women and girls, and clothing that does not permit a full range of movement for women and girls. So I mean, fishnets and stockings and skirts, these are not, they are not, regular or average clothes that promote like a reasonable range of movement for women and girls. Pants are human. They are, that you just wear them and you're comfortable and you move around more easily. Raymond notes that, like, women wearing pants, it gives them, it gives them the ease of movement that, yeah, is associated with men and has been historically associated with men. And actually, there is an interesting connection to the first wave of feminism, where women in the 19th century talked about dress reform. And as we know, the use of bloomers had to do with women wanting to create alternatives to the dresses that they had to wear for so long that were so restrictive, and that actually, like, they caused women um, literal health issues, that they wore these dresses that were corseted, that they obstructed women's movement, that they caused actual bodily issues for women. So it is fascinating, to and ironic to have men in the late 20th century to demand access to the restrictive clothing that women seeked for so long to escape, and that they had worked so long to escape that restrictive clothing, and that clothing that deprived them of full human movement, and essentially that infringed on women's dignity. So yeah, I think that is a really it is a significant point, and I think that Raymond makes it. It's really she beautifully illustrates it in the 1994 intro, with juxtaposing the men who essentially, like, they just come in, they put on skirts, dresses, they do a wonderful skirt go spinny type thing, and they get to be pretty, in quotation marks, and that this is, however, restrictive. This clothing, the fishnets and stockings and so on, it is restrictive to women, and these are clothes or types of clothing that women have seeked to escape from, but that in men's definition of women, quote unquote, or men's definition of womanhood, quote unquote, that it takes the meaning of woman, that the outfits obscure what women are and come to define what women actually are, which is part of the horror of the redefinition there. Um, and did anybody else? And thank you so much, Michael, for bringing up that passage. I love that. I love that passage um, from the 1994 intro. And if nobody else has anything they want to mention, we'll go over the doublethink intro. And as I've noted, it will be a little bit quicker, because it's also slightly shorter than the others, the intros to Transsexual Empire, the 79 and the 1994 intros were pretty long. So the intro to Doublethink is a little bit shorter. But it talks about some important things that I think uh, listeners will find interesting about the publication of Transsexual Empire and subsequent issues that Raymond experienced following the publication of Transsexual Empire. She talks about, as I noted before, that the book that original work began as her PhD dissertation. That in the early 70s she had done work with the women's health movement and studying ways in which medical practices impacted the lives of women and girls. In fact, one of the areas that Raymond studied was known as psychosurgery, formerly called lobotomies. And she looked at the way in which psychosurgery was disproportionately, uh, women were actually subjected to psychosurgery at disproportionately higher numbers than men were. As a method of, in Raymond's view and in the view of feminists who critiqued psychosurgery, it was a method of social control and of dealing with these women who were seen as unruly or who were designated mentally ill by men in their families, and then they were taken away and subjected to psychosurgery or lobotomized. So Raymond mentions the continual attack on her from using the title Transsexual Empire. So they say, well, oh well, that makes you a conspiracy theorist, um, because of of the word empire. But the point of that title, as she explains, was not that it's all shady and that it is a shadowy cabal. In fact, it's not a shadowy cabal. That there was actually, and now certainly is, a gender industry that involves transsexual counseling, surgery, and hormone treatments. And the industry, she says, deploys a horde of general surgeons, plastic surgeons, endocrinologists, gynecologists, urologists, and psychiatrists in service of transgenderism. In that sense, it is an empire. it is an expansive empire. And she points out that, of course, what she wrote about then has since expanded into a kind of gender identity industrial complex. Um, and by the late 80s, so this referring to Sandy Stone, although she doesn't mention him here, she notes that by the late 80s, trans activists, including Stone, had challenged the original feminist critique, which this was actually separate to the sex wars of the 1980s, but they began to challenge the feminist position, and they inverted it to say, well, the conformity to the sex roles through medicalization was actually like that it challenged gender. Instead of what the feminists said, which they said that the medicalization of the sex roles, that was, the feminist had originally said, well, that was not a challenge to gender, that was a challenge to feminism. But what the trans activists did was they inverted it and totally flipped around the position. Um, and which then they took took roles in the women's studies departments, and those then turned into gender studies. And as we know today, those original women's studies departments are virtually all gender studies, or they are some variation of women gender sexuality studies. And she discusses how, she says, as I saw it then and I see it now, transsexualism and transgenderism raise questions of what gender is and how to challenge it, questions that have become more critical to ask and answer in this expanding ethos of transgenderism, an ideology and practice that promotes a quote unquote gender identity different from the sex a person is born with. And in the new wave of transgenderism, Raymond notes it is that gender becomes biology, and that gender takes on a kind of force of nature for trans activists, which previously, when we think about the 1960s and the development of transsexualism, the legitimation of it was top down from John Money, from Harry Benjamin, from Richard Green, Robert Stoller, these men who defined and talked about like the distinction between sex and gender and treatments of it as a psychiatric disorder, which they didn't really regard necessarily as a disorder, except that they medicalized it, but then they didn't explain that it had any kind of real basis, except it was a desire. Um, so we note that there's actually a significant shift from 79 to 2021, where it seems like the professionals are now no longer required to legitimate it, because it has spread across society in such a way that now it is legitimized at every level of society. So it became unmoored from where once it was more of a clinical domain. Now it is everywhere. So it in a way it escaped the lab, and it is out. And she talks about how uh, doublethink, that it is much more about girls and women who are transitioning and detransitioning, whereas there were very few females in the 1970s and 1980s who turned to transsexualism and resorted to hormones and surgeries, which is significant that there was that shift, where originally virtually all of the patients treated at the gender clinics were male. So they were overwhelmingly male, and statistics indicated as much. The patient cohort has flipped, and so many of those being treated are in fact women and young girls. Now there's still a large segment of men going into the clinics, but it is there's there has been a shift, and a significant shift that Raymond recognizes in Doublethink. She also points out how she wrote a chapter in Transsexual Empire called Sappho by Surgery, and mentioned that men who claim to be women would also claim to be lesbians, which Sandy Stone did in the women's community, or in the lesbian community rather, in the 70s. And certainly men now, and I wrote in a note on the page, um, Sappho by surgery has become Sappho by speech. So men no longer have to undergo any kind of surgery, or have to do anything. They now can just say they are lesbians by speech. So it did actually go from surgery to speech. And Raymond talks about the biologizing of illusions, that is, that the trans obsessions, such as men desiring to menstruate, become pregnant, lactate, these being these, female functions, that they are desired in a fetishistic way, that is to be granted to them through medicalization. Raymond notes with some, like, she talks about it as a kind of dubious honor, of being the first turf. And of course we know that turf has expanded to be anyone, particularly women, of course, but really expanding to encompass anyone who slightly objects to transgenderism. But Raymond was certainly a foremother in the that dubious honor of being, of being a turf. Um, say dubious honor because of the harassment that it entails, but and Raymond talks about some of that early censorship that she experienced. That she doesn't discuss it in the 1994 intro. She discusses it in Doublethink here. She says, "Quote: For me, the censorship happened right from the get-go. In the early 1970s, as a graduate student, I had applied for a grant to research and write the dissertation that would become the Transsexual Empire. A prestigious U.S. foundation contacted me to say that the grant had been awarded and needed only some uh, pro forma administrative signatures. Since one bonus of the grant was paid health insurance, they asked me to make an appointment for a health physical, a standard part of the insurance application process, an exam they paid for and which I promptly underwent. Several weeks later, a colleague who worked at the foundation and who had endorsed my application informed me that the faculty associated with a prominent university gender identity clinic where I had conducted some interviews had complained that my investigation would threaten their work. This was a backhanded compliment, and needless to say, they nixed my grant." So they actually, she talks about how they cut a grant, prevented her from receiving a grant, on the basis of her early criticism of transsexualism. Then, after the 1994 publication of that reprint of the Transsexual Empire, in 1995, a man had contacted the Teachers College Press, that is to say, the publisher, and claimed that the original preface was deliberately omitted from the book, which, by the way, is not really that big of a deal. The book, it was worked into the 1994 intro. But the man claimed that it was a case of scholarly misconduct, and basically tried to have the 1994 edition of the book pulled, because he argued that because the book did not print that preface, which I think was a couple pages, because it didn't print the preface from the original 79 edition, that it somehow violated scholarly principles, and therefore pull the book from the shelves. And so the man who accused her of that, he continued with the attack and tried very hard to have her book pulled. However, the academic dean eventually dropped the charge of academic fraud, which made no sense. It was a frivolous claim, but the attempt was to have her book pulled. And then around that same period, so this is in the 1990s, after she published Women as Wombs, which was a critique of sexual and reproductive technologies in 1993, and had to do with their impacts on women. Um, she was at a bookstore. So she was doing the launch of Women as Wombs about reproductive technologies. And by the way, the book had nothing to do with transsexualism. She did not mention transsexualism or transgenderism. Um, Not necessarily in the book. There wasn't anything extensive about it in that book, but trans activists showed up anyway to the Feminist bookstore in New York City where she did the book launch, and they protested her. And she had to walk through a gauntlet of protesters who were threatening, who would follow her to any speaking event, even if the event had nothing to do with transsexualism or transgenderism. They still came after her. And then um, after she had retired and this was from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where she had served as a professor of ethics and a professor of women's studies. Uh, they actually issued a statement on their website that said, quote unquote, given the persistence of legacies of trans exclusionary radical feminism, including its presence in the history of women's studies in the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and in response to requests for clarification on this issue from trans communities at UMass and the Pioneer Valley, we categorically reject transphobia in our department, on our campus, and in our discipline. She notes that the turf in question was not named, but it was obvious who the department was referring to because nobody else was as identified as with radical feminism as her, and nobody else had written and done research and writing on transgenderism or transsexualism and transgenderism the way that she did. So they issued after her retirement, they issued this, what she calls this apology for my unspecified presence. That in the department felt like a heretic sentence at her delayed execution, end quote. So they specifically, went out of their way to publish a statement, saying that they regret the way in which trans exclusionary radical feminism had been in their department, um, which tells you that they do not stand uh, by their professors. And she discusses, and this kind of recaps some of the points that were already made in the 1994 intro. She references Sheila Jeffrey's Gender Hurts from 2014, that the word gender was not really used as much in the 70s, that most often feminists used the term sex roles, and that term was used throughout the transsexual empire. And in fact, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that early early version of the transsexual empire that Raymond wrote in 77 was titled Transsexualism: The Ultimate Homage to Sex Role Power. So originally sex role was the common terminology that was used as opposed to gender, and feminists used sex role and sex roles. Um, then of course it fell into just gender, which became a more medical and psychological term, and a term that was more abstract and easier to use in the context of something like, say, gender dysphoria. And so then Raymond mentions that Jeffries talks about how gender became euphemistic for men, for things like male violence against women, which became gender based violence, and that this went along with the shift where sex became switched with gender increasingly, and gender became a stand in for sex as if gender were itself biological. And she notes some of the dizzying ways that language has multiplied and become so ridiculous as a result of trans uh, trans tyranny and the force that it has exerted on language. Um, she talks about the branding of women as transphobic, that it functions to make people into fearful bystanders, incapable of expressing an honest opinion. And I like the line where she says, quote, "Many people want to remain ignorant, not the ignorance of innocence, but a chosen ignorance that wills not to know." And that was a line that I really liked from Doublethink, from that intro, because it really underscores that the ignorance is not it's not innocent, but it's that people do not want to know what the reality is. Um, and let's see. And she notes the importance of refusing to capitulate to language on the terms of trans activist. So refusing to use she, her for men, or he, him, his for women. Refusing to engage in these reversals, that it matters. It matters to make a conscious objection to it. I think it's interesting in the intro she mentions, when it comes to feminist, she says, quote, "We champion a feminism unmodified," as Catherine McKinnon has written, although these days she doesn't seem to accept that feminism unmodified must stand on the shoulders of females unmodified, women who refuse to be defined by men. She makes a crack at McKinnon, who has become over the years a prominent uh, kind of trans activist, strangely, in old age. And of course, she was decades ago, but that is another story. Um, and I think one of the lines that she has here too is she says, quote, "Men who identify as women are now capturing a primary place in the history of women." Um, End quote. And so that it she does point to the redefinition of women on men's terms, uh, and she talks about uh, there was a discussion of the perpetrators of violence against men, against, and in this case, quote unquote, trans women, that it is most frequently domestic partners. And it's most often men who know the man is actually male. So it is not strangers going out and just killing random men in dresses, that it is most often men who are intimate with them. And she also points out the fact that violence against women who declare themselves men is virtually, like, statistics on it are virtually non existent, compared to the amount of statistics for men who declare themselves women, which is interesting that there are more statistics about men than there are about women, and there's more concern about the violence that the men experience, um, versus the women. And she also notes that, like, the violence against women within the trans or quote unquote queer community, part of what makes it difficult is that in some cases, as she points out, it ends up being violence that is perpetrated by other, like, trans and or quote unquote queer people. So it actually ends up being the men within these communities, and there is a tendency not to want to name it and not to want to name that violence. She points to a collection called You Told Me You Were Different, an anthology of harm, edited by Kitty Robinson, which I recommend, because she writes, quote, this is Kitty. She says, when someone who has been victimized by a male trans person believes that male trans people are the most stigmatized, oppressed, at-risk people on the earth, the act of staying silent about your abuse is positioned as the only morally good option. So women end up being silent because they feel that they should keep these men safe. And that is horrific emotional blackmail that so many of these young women in particular experience. And Raymond talks about the value of the voices of women who were formerly trans, but who have realized that transition did not solve the underlying problems that they experienced, and that they had since then experienced, or they had since came to a kind of, quote unquote detransition, which is really embracing their bodies as themselves and returning to a sense of bodily integrity. um, and she talks about the honesty and the value of those narratives. And the goal of Doublethink actually was to amplify those survivors. And so, one of the things to end with is the language is so difficult. And she uses an epigraph from George Orwell, from his book 1984, where he writes, quote, all that was needed was an unending series of victories over your own memory. Reality control, they called it in Newspeak. Doublethink. And this was from Orwell's 1984. And we see this occur in the difficulty that women have with language. Um, I think that the best way to deal with it is to emphasize men and women and not try to, in some cases that we do say, we have to say like trans identified, to acknowledge like that it is someone who claims that status. One of the kind of confusing things about Doublethink is Raymond, she tries to do this point, and I'll make this at the end as a criticism of the language. She tries to use like self-declared man and self-declared woman. So by self-declared woman, it refers to men, and self-declared man refers to women. So that, and it is very confusing. And I think she tried to negotiate like being able to acknowledge like the self-declaredness of the status of like trans identified people, um but it does not work out very well in the language, and so there are moments where the language gets kind of muddled in passages because it can be confusing. The alternative would have been to say men who declare themselves women, women who declare themselves men, which is a mouthful each time. So that is that's one of the difficulties with the use of language, and with the problems that transsexualism and transgenderism have presented for us in terms of language. And she quotes Orwell again on language. Um, she says, quote, doublethink means, and this is quoting Winston Smith, doublethink means holding two contradictory beliefs in one's mind simultaneously, to tell deliberate lies while genuinely believing them, to deny the existence of objective reality. And she says that there's a difficulty in the challenge that we confront a language that has corrupted reality and a gender industry that sustains it. And so that is the intro to Doublethink. She does recap, talking about the issues around men declaring themselves lesbians and male violence against women. Doublethink focuses more, as she says, on the survivors and emphasizing women surviving, um, surviving transgenderism and actually like surviving the violence that they are subjected to, especially within the quote unquote trans and quote unquote queer community. So that was the intro to Doublethink. Um, so, uh, here at the very end, I'm very thankful that we've had listeners who have stayed along for the talk through those intros. Thank you all so much for listening. I will be planning future spaces and recordings to be announced via Substack and social media. I would like to do a few shorter recordings as well for more brief commentaries that may or may not be spaces themselves. There will be a transcription of this one available on my Substack, linked in the description below. If you found value in this introduction to Janice G. Raymond's work on transsexualism and transgenderism, then please like, subscribe, and share. It all helps. Again, thank you all so much.